Obviously, everyone should know Catherine. Those who don't know Catherine, well, she is a very famous Law Squared art and doing some really wonderful things at Wendy Brooks and Partners, and of course supporting our employment team as and when needed. Wendy Brooks and Partners obviously run a fundraising consultancy largely for not-for-profits, and Catherine dobbed herself in to do a CPD for the 10 Network next week. And those who don't know 10 Network, it's one of those usual CPD providers, often for lawyers, and from what I hear, very critical lawyers who like to be very strict about their CPD. And unfortunately, Catherine is unable to deliver the CPD next week, so has thrown me under the bus, and I will deliver the CPD on her behalf next week. But I thought it was really useful for Catherine to not only present that to the team, but also so I can hear it and make lots of notes. So a big thank you, Catherine. Looking forward to obviously this information. Not only is it useful for us, but also a lot of our clients are in the NFP space, particularly from our employment team, but also that trickles out primarily to our commercial and then corporate team. So big thank you, and over to you.
Thanks so much, everyone. I really appreciate your time, because this is really to benefit Demetrio and I, but I really think that hopefully it'll give you a great overview of this fundraising law space, which the title is Navigating the NFP and Charities Fundraising Maze, and it really is a maze at the moment, unfortunately. So I'll take you through the current disgusting situation of our regulatory legislation. And, you know, hopefully one day we'll see some change, but it's probably going to be like the work health and safety laws, where we have a few states that are happy to harmonise and get their crap together when it comes to harmonising the laws, and then there's going to be a few states that don't want to. So I think we're all, as lawyers, we're always going to need to be aware that there's a diverse range of legislation when it comes to fundraising laws. So I'll take you through that, and also some of the lobbying that's been going on to change this. So I'm not that great at Teams, but let me see if I can share my slides for you. And oh yeah, I can see it. So fingers crossed I can make this work. Oh, now you can you see my backdrop now? Or can you see the slides?
We can see your backdrop.
Okay. Oh. Grace, this is why I need you. Oh, there you go. Is that right? You see the slides now, Dee?
Yeah, that's better. Thanks.
Okay, fantastic. So just before we get started, I'd like to do an acknowledgement of country. So I acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet. I'm actually in Geelong, so I've bought a house in Geelong, loving the regional life. So the traditional owners of the lands on which I am on are the Wathaurong or Wadawurrung people, and I've been trying to learn some of the language. So Nua Warin is greetings, hello, and I acknowledge that land was never ceded and sovereignty was never ceded, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So in relation to what I'm going to go over through today, this is what Television Education Network said that we needed to present on. So first off, we're going to have a look at what activities actually constitute fundraising, because obviously there's whole different ways in which a not-for-profit can fundraise. They can fundraise through general community donations, but they can also fundraise in other ways. So I'll take you through that. Number two, specific requirements and exemptions for ACNC registered bodies. So for those that don't know, ACNC is the Charities Commission. So if you're a charity, you need to, you've got specific requirements around meeting and complying with the ACNC regulations. Number three, the implications of cross-border fundraising. So this is where things get really tricky, because our fundraising laws fundamentally were set up before, a long time ago, before online fundraising. So a lot of not-for-profits would just fundraise locally, only had to comply with one state. Now, obviously, that's got by the by, because if you put out a fundraising campaign on social media, you could be getting funds in from all across the country. And basically the laws say that you need to be aware where the money is coming from and comply with a range of different laws. So I'll take you through that. Number four, we've got additional legal and regulatory implications for online fundraising that we need to be aware of. Five, what do organisations need to do to manage and safeguard their online fundraising activities. That was a bit of an interesting one, sort of non-legal, that I got my our general manager, to help me with. But I think that's where Dee's going to come into his own, because he's so across, privacy laws and credit issues, etc. Number 6, the application of the Australian consumer law. I actually loved researching this part of it. You guys are probably across the ACL much more than me. So my background is a accredited specialist in employment law, but I found it really interesting to go through the ACL laws, harking back to my university days, in relation to misleading and deceptive conduct, unconscionable conduct. And I thought of some lessons from recent cases. I did do a lot of research, Dee, over the cases over the last 12 months, and there wasn't really anything relevant. So I've just picked up the cases that are as recent as possible, but actually will make it interesting. And so you'll see there's one around the Shane Warne Foundation. Look, it might be a bit on the nose to talk about Shane Warne, seeing as he's died, but such a crucial case around non-compliance. So I thought I really had to raise it. So in the talk, you might want to say, we're not dissing Shane Warne, and, may he rest in peace. It's just a case that's of relevance. And number 7, developments in fundraising reforms. So there has been a huge amount of campaigning to try and change the mess of fundraising laws. So I'll take you through where we're up to with that. So I've just got a nice quote here. Fundraising is vitally important for charities, but the ends do not necessarily justify the means. So successful fundraising should not be measured solely on the amount that's been raised, but it's really important for a charity to protect its reputation, to conduct its fundraising and interact with the community, particularly given that you might be interacting with people in vulnerable circumstances. So we need to just be really careful about that and make sure that our fundraising activities don't undermine our really good work. So the goal and the key really when you're considering fundraising is to have a strategy first. So why is it that we're seeking funds? And we work with our clients to go through come up with a strategic plan for their fundraising, to make sure that everyone is aware of what it is that we're raising funds for, so that we've got a really strong strategy that sits behind the fundraising activities. So for example, you might decide that you've got a specific program that is underfunded currently, that if you were able to get more funding would really benefit a significant portion of your community, and therefore you're going to develop a fundraising plan that is specifically raising funds for that project. And in that instance, you need to then make sure that the funds are dispersed to that project. So transparency is really key around telling the people that you're fundraising with and that you're trying to seek donations from what it is that you're raising funds for, having transparency around the fact that those funds have been dispersed. We have actually worked for a client who raised a whole lot of funds and then didn't want to distribute those funds. They were really nervous about actually parting ways with that money. And we're saying, you've told the people that have donated that this is where the money is going to. You have to deliver on that. Also really important that we keep oversight of our activities. There's a lot of organisations that actually engage external fundraising providers. Obviously, we're an external fundraising provider as a consultancy, but we don't specialise in general community campaigns. So, for example, you might have a really big organisation such as World Vision. They might outsource a general community campaign. So it might be a telephone calling process. It might be a big social media campaign. They might outsource that to an external party, but you as the board or as in-house legal counsel must still be across what is happening in relation to those fundraising activities, because that is where things can go awry. If a for-profit company has been tasked with bringing in funds for your organisation, we have to make sure that they do it in the right way, that they do it in line with the strategy, they're transparent about it, they stick to the rules, and they treat our people within our community with that respect and in line with what we want them to do. And then we have to make sure we're dispersing the funds. And there are specific rules around how much you should be dispersing. Not so much how, like specifically how much, but if you disperse less than a certain amount, then there might be questions from the regulatory bodies. For example, AC&C might ask you, if you're dispersing less than 30% of the funds that you're raising, why, and why should we allow that? And I'll take you through a specific case study on that too. So your organisation has to determine its fundraising strategy, confirm the fundraising laws that then apply to those fundraising activities. So we'll go through that in some detail. ensure those laws apply to your organisation. So it's really frustrating because in each state, there's a different set of rules around when the laws apply. Some of those laws apply to charities and others apply to not-for-profits. But you might think, oh, well, I know my organisation is deemed a charity or my organisation is deemed a not-for-profit. It's a different definition under the fundraising laws as to what is a charity and what is a not-for-profit. So you can't just assume that you know our organisation is not-for-profit. You have to check the actual definition in the state-based legislation. So then we've got to seek to or confirm the relevant approvals that we've got to be able to fundraise. That's depending on our activities and our geographical scope. Then we've got to continuously comply with and report on your obligations related to fundraising activities. So there's different reporting requirements, but some have been streamlined, thankfully. Excuse me. And we've got to continue to communicate transparently with our funders, our donors, to keep them abreast of the fundraising activities and where the funds are being spent. All right, so let's have a look at what activities constitute fundraising. So the ACNC provides some general information in this regard. There's some actually amazing resources out there on the internet. I think that the power of our paper that we've pulled together is that it pulls all of those resources into one document for people, but the ACNC has specific resources for each state. So it really is the first port of call for organisations wanting to understand how do I get the information for each state. So the ACNC specifies that fundraising generally includes soliciting public donations if you do like a door knock or street collections, or, you know, you might see in shopping centres, people approaching other people. Might even include holding public events if there's an admission fee, holding fundraising events. So it might be in partnership with others such as a fun run, a gala dinner, raffles or other games. Apparently bingo is big in some states like WA. Social investment or social impact bonds is a new area which many of our clients are starting to come to us about, wanting to learn more about. And that's specifically because really I think Paul Ramsay Foundation, which is the biggest, one of the biggest foundations in Australia, has started saying to not-for-profits that we can help you get ready to receive social investment or social impact bonds, and they're giving not-for-profits funds to get ready for that type of investment. So that's a really interesting new area of fundraising. And then obviously there's community fundraising through crowdsourcing. It might be social media campaigns, or it might also be microfinancing. So you can see it's pretty broad, but you do need to consider, do our activities that we want to do, we've set our strategy around what we want to fundraise for. Now we need to consider how we're going to be bringing in those funds, and do they fit within what these fundraising activities are. But what is actually regulated? So there's a whole lot of fundraising activities, not all of them are regulated. So these ones are charities running a fundraising appeal, a group running a fundraising campaign for a charitable purpose, and third-party commercial fundraisers that are raising funds on behalf of a charity or a not-for-profit. So remember I talked about before, someone like a big organisation like World Vision, they might engage a third party who's a for-profit organisation that specialises in this type of campaigning, this type of fundraising. Another example is UNICEF, who I give to. They have an external fundraising provider who helps them do their hard mail out. So, you know, if you receive donation requests in the mail, that's another example of an external party. You know, a charity can't possibly do all of that work, so they outsource that. So that third party commercial fundraiser has to be compliant as well as the organisation. The second one, a group running a fundraising campaign for a charitable purpose. That might be, we've seen a really interesting rise in giving circles. I'm a member of a giving circle where each of you contribute an amount, you pool your funds, and then you get to choose each year who you're going to distribute those funds to. It might be a range of charities. So in that instance, we are raising funds for a charitable purpose. We're then distributing those funds. So we need to be compliant with the laws as well. And clearly, if charities are running a fundraising appeal, they're going to be covered. So that's kind of an easy one. So probably my advice would be always err on the side of caution, that you're probably, if you're participating in fundraising, you're probably going to be covered. So it's best to look into it and see what kind of approvals you need to gain. So as I said, regulation differs depending on the applicable jurisdiction. you need to comply when you're raising funds for a community, patriotic, philanthropic, or animal welfare purpose. Where a not-for-profit that's not a charity raises funds for itself, you need to check, because it depends on the state. Corporate sponsorship is not always covered, so again, you need to check. Government funding, not always covered, most likely not covered. And gifts or wills is often excluded, but then I found doing my research that it's not excluded in South Australia and Tasmania. So if you don't know necessarily where your gifts and wills are going to be coming from, so this is when someone dies and they want to leave a gift in their will to a charity. It might be a percentage, it might be a house, it might be a specific asset, but they want to leave a gift in their will to you. And if they left a gift in their will to you and you didn't have fundraising approval in South Australia, we wouldn't be saying don't accept the gift in the will, obviously, but you'd probably need to consider getting specific approval so that you can accept that gift. So as I said there, you must check what activities are regulated, that's why we say strategy first, then look at your coverage. So when you're considering what fundraising regime applies, there's a few things that you need to think about. And this has been general guidance provided by the ACNC and other regulatory bodies. So we need to consider, one, where the receipt will be issued from. So if someone's making a donation, where are we as a charity going to be issuing our receipt from? Is it going to be in Sydney, our head office? Is it going to be in Melbourne, where the fundraising manager is? We need to think about that. We also need to think about where the making of the appeal is taking place. That's where it gets tricky, obviously, because you might be in Melbourne making the appeal, but you might do a few social media posts. So the appeal could be heard in South Australia or WA, for example. We also need to consider where the communications will be received and where the donation is coming from. So basically what we're saying is, if you think that people are going to be all around the country, you probably need to consider national compliance, which is a bit of a pain. So I wanted to pull in a case study, Dee, that you can utilise. We're currently working for this organisation called ABSEC, and they are this amazing Aboriginal-led organisation. It's the peak body for organisations that accept children in out-of-home care that are Aboriginal. So it's sort of a whole new world that I hadn't learnt about, but what ABSEC is really about is ensuring that kids stay connected to country, and if they do need to be exited out of their family home, they're still within an Aboriginal family or within connected to country. So they only operate in New South Wales because they're the peak body in New South Wales, and there's different peak bodies in each state. The first time that they're going to be running the end of financial year, like now, they're sending out their appeal now. So you guys might receive, emails from people saying, oh, it's, tax time coming up, make a donation to our cause. That's an end of financial year appeal. And we do generally recommend that our clients run at least an end of financial year appeal and an end of calendar year appeal. It's a really great way for them to engage with their supporters. So what we're saying to ABSEC is, run your end of financial appeal for the first time. Let's see what comes of it. Let's see what kind of support base you have. But they're only in New South Wales. They need to ensure that they've at least got approval to fundraise in New South Wales. So we've passed that on to their in-house counsel, their company secretary, the person in charge of governance basically is the one that would normally be in charge of this process. But because they don't have capacity to apply for approval in other states, they actually are not allowed legally to accept donations from outside of New South Wales. So we've actually drafted copy for their appeal, and I've put this in the paper, and it's in your notes, Dee. So the actual appeal says, tick a box, you are from New South Wales, and then we've got a little asterisk that says, if you're not from New South Wales, but you still would like to make a donation, please contact the fundraising manager, because I don't really want them to miss out on a $20,000 donation because we don't have the silly approval in that state. And if someone did ring up and said, we would like to make a $20,000 donation, we would then go get the fundraising approval for them. But if they called and they just wanted to make a $100 donation or $200 donation, we'd probably actually refer them to their state peak body, because ABSEC has those other bodies in different states. So I think that's one way to deal with it. But to be truthful, I haven't seen any other organisation do that, because people are just not aware that they have to do this. There's only 30% compliance in fundraising laws across the country. So I think a lot of organisations are just non-compliant, and there's no one really regulating where these donations are coming from. So, not many people do it, but I think for ABSEC it's kind of clear cut, because they are really only based in New South Wales, and they're only doing this amazing work for New South Wales organisations. So we need to make sure we're obtaining our approval to fundraise. And then we've got to look at the specific requirements and exemptions for ACNC registered bodies. I'm just going to let my dog in, excuse me. So there's 7 regulatory regimes. So this is why it's a bit annoying. Each state, and there's one territory, ACT, has a fundraising regime. There's no fundraising regime in Northern Territory, but they kind of use the consumer law to tackle the misleading, deceptive conduct stuff. But I'll take you through each different state laws, which will probably be the boring element of the presentation. But Television Education Network is really clear on the fact that people can come from all over the country, so we have to deal with each of the states. So we can probably just flick over those slides, but I'll demonstrate that. So as I said, these laws were established prior to the use of online and cross-jurisdictional fundraising. But since COVID, there's been a massive rise in online fundraising, because that was the only way that people could really do it during lockdown. So it's really just heightened the complexity of this system and the need that exists to harmonise the laws across the country. All right, so I'll just do a quick summary of the obligations, but all of this information is set out in detail in the paper. And also the ACNC has a link to every single different state-based requirement. So they've done a great job with that. So in Victoria, South Australia and the ACT, if you're registered as a charity with the ACNC, then that's sufficient for an organisation to engage in their fundraising activity. But you'll see on another slide, you still have to do one step further, another process. In New South Wales, charities registered with the ACNC are automatically eligible to fundraise, but you still have to submit an application form, which is the same in Victoria as well. So I've just put a little note there. Fundraising campaigns by a registered charity must align with the charity's organisational purpose. Again, why it's so important to do strategy first, because the fundraising that you do, you can't just be like, that's a great idea, we want to fundraise for that cause. It has to align with your actual purpose as set out in your governing documents. So I mentioned in Victoria, you do have to do one step further. So fundraising activity in Victoria, it's actually regulated by Consumer Affairs. And then there's also the Victorian Commission for Gambling and Liquor, if you're going down that path. And you probably would have seen this if you're on social media and you see posts for competitions, they sometimes register these, mention these regulatory bodies. So the CAB regulates and oversees the laws. These are the laws in Vic. You've got the Fundraising Act 1998 and you've got the Fundraising Regulations 2009. So you can see there's been a real attempt in Victoria to update our laws to make sure that they're more in line with online fundraising and cross-jurisdictional fundraising. So if you're registered with ACNC, so if you're a charity, all you have to do is notify CAB via their portal. So they've got a specific portal. You go in, you put in your forms and you say you're a charity and now you want to register that you're going to be fundraising. So that's the process. If you're not if you're just a not-for-profit, then if you're you'll need to consider how you can comply in Victoria. So fundraising in New South Wales, it's regulated by New South Wales Fair Trading, different legislation there, but you can see again the regulation has been updated in 2021, which is good. Interestingly, in New South Wales, you have to submit a terms of appeal. So that actually sets out the objectives of your fundraising and you have to set out a plan about how you're going to deliver that. So as fundraising consultants, strategic fundraising consultants, I think that's pretty cool because it requires a bit of thought around this activity, but I think there'd be a huge number of not-for-profits that wouldn't be able to show that they've got a terms of appeal. In the ACT, it's regulated by Access Canberra, so there's different legislation there. It hasn't been updated, you know, that recently, 2003. And you've also got this Lotteries Act. In Northern Territory, as I said, there's no legislation. They just use consumer law, but there is the Gaming Control Act, and rules and guidelines also apply under this Northern Territory Code of Practice for Responsible Gambling. In Queensland, you've got, it's regulated by the Office of Fair Trading, and they administer the laws. So you've got the Collections Act and the Collections Regulation. In South Australia, it's regulated by the Consumer and Business Services, and you're actually required to have a collections for charitable purposes license. So you can't just say, I'm registered with the ACNC, you actually have to register for this license. Fundraising in Tasmania, it's Consumer Building and Occupational Services, and there's legislation there from 2001 and 2011. WA, you can see it's a bit longer. They've just got these really long names for regulation and legislation. So it's regulated by the Consumer Protection Division. Industry regulation and safety. So yeah, it's a really big part of their regulatory body that obviously looks after this very small component in fundraising. And then consumer protection actually regulates fundraising through that Charitable Collections Act, 1946. So a bit outdated. So once you've worked out what covers your activities and how you seek that approval, you've then got to look at ongoing reporting obligations. So you can imagine this is a really fun space for your governance committee. So you've got to work out, are our reporting obligations to ACNC? That's basically the best option. If you're a charity, you're registered with ACNC, you're in New South Wales or Vic, for example, great. It's so much easier because all you're doing is providing your normal information statement, which includes questions around fundraising. So that's kind of the best option. But it's really important, even if you're excluded from the fundraising regime, you've got to keep records around your fundraising activities because you're still required to have them on file in case any of the regulatory bodies are inspecting and want to understand more. And I'll talk about a case study in relation to that too. So the next topic was around what organisations need to do to manage and safeguard their online fundraising activities. So again, thankfully, not each regulatory regime has different rules around online fundraising. Some actually just don't even mention it at all, but some have grappled with it, like South Australia. And I noted when I even read, guys, the regulation in South Australia, and I picked up that there's an actual code which requires internet advertising of a fundraising appeal to include the following information. So the charity's name, the purpose for which funds are being collected, and the charity's website. And that is pretty consistent where there is regulation that says you need to, which deals with online fundraising. It's really just around making sure that you're being really transparent and making the community know, the organisation that's actually raising the funds, why we're raising the funds, and putting the website so they can find out more information if they want to. So again, it's all around this concept of transparency, really. And then I've just did a bit of research around other regimes or standards that could apply. So there's some information around the payment card industry data security standards, which again, Dee might know more about than me. And there's the Privacy Act, which provides the privacy principles, obviously only applicable for some not-for-profits, but worth keeping in mind. And then important to consider implementing payment fraud protection through your payment gateway provider, just to make sure that you're preventing fraudulent donations, because if they are submitted, you won't get to keep the money. Sorry, I just couldn't. Okay, so now my favourite topic, application of the ACL. So generally, if you engage in fundraising activities, then we've now got to shift from the definitions under the fundraising law about what activities apply to looking at now the fundraising activities that apply under the ACL, because it's different. So under the ACL, fundraising activities that involve the supply of goods or services. So I was thinking like, the Cancer Council sell their teddy bears or their sunscreen, for example. But services could be a charity that provides NDIS cleaning services, for example. Or if you're a for-profit professional fundraiser, again, those external organisations that help charities do those mass campaigns. Or this is their clincher that's going to get nearly all of our clients. If you're fundraising in an organised, continuous and repetitive way, then you'll be captured under the ACL. So you're likely to be deemed in trade or commerce, and you'll have these certain obligations under the ACL. And why I say that third one will capture most of our clients, because they're organised, they've got a strategy. When they do their fundraising, they hire people to do that, whether it's internal, external like us. They continuously do them. They set up the end of financial year campaigns, for example, so that they're running every year. They're repetitive in that way. So that's going to capture them under the ACL. So if they're captured, and then it says for fundraising activities to be deemed to be carried out in a business-like way, which is falls under that third category. They're generally organised, managed through business plans and strategies. They might be, subject to policies and procedures. And we do have a fundraising policy, Dee, which you probably should mention, because there'll be a lot of charities that are not-for-profits that don't have a fundraising policy. So that's something that we can easily help them tailor for their organisation. Or the entity is established such that its activities are likely to continue. The fundraising activities are promoted or marketed, which obviously they would be if we're trying to reach more people. And there's financial other records that are maintained, which you need to do anyway. But it's pretty simple to comply, I think, with the ACL obligations. Just don't engage in misleading or deceptive conduct. So don't tell people that we're going to do something that we're not. Don't say that they're signing up to a one-off payment if it's a regular payment. These are the types of examples that have been raised. And don't engage in unconscionable conduct. So that's really around making sure that, we're dealing with vulnerable people in a really good way. And I'll take you through some other activities. But what happens if ACL thinks that there's a breach? So regulators will investigate complaints. They can issue infringement notices. They can take court action. There's monetary penalties, maximum 1.1 mil for corporations and 220,000 for individuals. There can be court enforceable undertakings of, what to do, what not to do, wind down, blah, blah, blah. And there can also be corrective advertising. So if you advertise in a certain space and they found that that was misleading or deceptive conduct, they can say that you have to put corrective advertising in that same space. I wanted to talk about this Belle Gibson case. I don't know if any of you guys remember Belle Gibson. I actually followed her. This is years and years ago because I was living in Sydney at the time, and I was really into health and wellbeing because I have multiple sclerosis. And Belle Gibson had these really good recipes of just clean, simple food. The element I didn't like so much about her was that she was saying she was healing herself through food. She had cancer, and by eating this amazing food, she'd gotten rid of her own cancer. What it turned out was she never had the cancer, and an investigative journalist found this out when she got really big, and she actually got an Apple book deal for her recipe book. And an investigative journalist found out and uncovered that she actually never had cancer. And the reason why what she did was so dangerous is she was encouraging others to not accept cancer treatment and to reject cancer treatment if they followed her methodology. So the fact that it turned out she didn't have cancer in the first place is just appalling. So the case deals with misleading and deceptive conduct, but also unconscionable conduct for the promotion of a book and the smartphone app. She also said as part of her promises that profits that she raised were going to go to certain charities. But when this investigation happened, it was found that none of those, a very little amount. She only made 3 donations totaling 10,000 to those charities. So she was given extensive fines for failing to actually donate proceeds. So again, remember that philosophy around being transparent, but then also distributing funds is really important if you've promised that to consumers. So fundamentally, the responsibility lies with the board, and I think that's really important for them to consider. Excuse me. Often when we're engaged to work with a not-for-profit, we insist that our first port of call is a workshop with the board. And sometimes it's the first time that they've ever really given any thought to the fundraising activities of the organisation. Obviously, from a financial perspective, they're looking at what fundraising is bringing in, but they're not often a part of the actual formulation of the strategy. So they're not really across the fundraising activities of the organisation or the proposed fundraising activities, because they might get a really great fundraising person in for the first time, but not really understand the responsibilities that they have that ties with that role and the activities. So I think it's really important that we understand that the board should be regularly briefed on fundraising activities. And Dee, I thought that there's a potential on-sell opportunity here too, because we can run training, as in we, Law Squared and Wendy Brooks and Partners joined, we can run training for boards on the fundraising strategy and activities, like the different ways in which you can come up with a fundraising strategy, the different market segments that a charity can approach, how money is raised, the appropriate and lawful processes in place to manage any money raised, how they need to be aware of, how funds raised need to be used, and also things such as the privacy stuff around how donor information will be stored. Also, they need to be aware of how fundraisers are going to handle fundraising with vulnerable persons. It's a really big component. There's a whole chapter on that they need to be aware of, and any applicable fundraising policies, procedures, codes of conduct, best practice principles, along with also how a breach to those documents will be really swiftly dealt with. And I've got a really great case study example of that. So boards, obviously, whenever you put together a policy, it needs to specify what happens if there's a breach of that policy, i.e. investigation, review, disciplinary action. This case study is in relation to an organisation called Street Swags. And I'm really sorry that this organisation has been brought into disrepute, because when I was working at Clayton Utes in Brisbane, they were actually financial supporters of Street Swags, and I got to meet the founder, Jean, and she was this amazing young woman, and I thought what they do is great. It's a bit of a band-aid. What they provided was swags for people that are living on the street, and this came about after one of the Brisbane River floodings. They wanted to make sure that those that didn't have a home at least had somewhere warm to stay, somewhere safe to be in overnight. So they developed these street swags that didn't look very attractive, so they weren't going to be stolen by others, but people could really be warm and safe at night. So what happened here, though, was that there was a leadership dispute. Some of the board, I think, started questioning where the funds were going, and this then led to loss of donor confidence. There was reputational damage, and obviously that's going to happen when there are concerns raised about the distribution of the funds. So the board were investigating where are their funds going. There was then a criminal investigation raised. Then an unfair dismissal claim was brought by the CEO. The unfair dismissal claim had to go on pause whilst the criminal investigation happened. For some reason, it was subsequently dropped. But when the unfair dismissal claim then proceeded, Fair Work Commission found in favour of the employer and said you were right to dismiss her because she was dishonest with you in answering where the funds were going. There was also concerns around conflict of interest. She engaged one of her, I think it was a boyfriend or something. But the key part of this is that, and I feel really sorry for the board, what happened was that they estimate donations plunged 30% because of this court case. So I guess what I'm saying and what this case highlights is the board has to be across its fundraising activities. Where are funds going? Where are they going to be spent? And if you're concerned by any measure of where those funds are going, you have to act really swiftly to make sure that this doesn't blow out to be a big case where there could be serious reputational damage, because the regulatory bodies can fine an organisation, but it's really the reputational damage that's going to lead to a loss of general community donations. But I wanted to talk about when will the ACNC intervene, because we've talked about the ACL. So the ACNC will this is the Charities Commission, just remember, they will intervene if there's failure to protect and account for all the funds raised, if you've got weak governance, so there's no one doing the cross-checking and reviewing of the finances. You've got for-profit fundraising arrangements that don't comply with the laws, where there's been damage to public trust and confidence, and obviously where there's any criminality. So the case study in this one, I think, was really relevant. Again, Shane Warne, may he rest in peace, but the Shane Warne Foundation case deals with a failure to maintain and submit financial information. So there was some kind of report that came out, in the news around, I remember this, around the fact that I think it was less than 10% of the funds that had been raised actually were distributed. He had set up this foundation for kids in need, really great concept. He'd been able to raise a lot of money because of his amazing reputation, been putting on these really big events, but actually didn't realize how to run a foundation and didn't realize the costs associated with running these really big events, and just didn't have enough left over, I'm guessing, didn't have enough left over to distribute to the actual people that he was raising funds for. So this case deals with where there's a failure to maintain and submit financial information, and how ACNC and the regulator will investigate when there are concerns raised about the distribution of funds. So he failed to donate. The ACNC says when you fail to donate at least 35% of the money raised, you actually need to seek specific permission from the ACNC that you can distribute less than 35%. And because he didn't distribute 35%, he was sort of called in to say why he hadn't distributed that. So then there was an 11-month investigation that went through the process of reviewing all of what had happened. And because he'd kept such awful records, the foundation actually demonstrated non-compliance because they hadn't kept those records, but they were cleared of unlawful conduct because there were no records that the investigators could use to say that it had been non-compliant. So it was just this big debacle. But in the end, the foundation provided an undertaking that it was going to wind up. I just can't believe this, but he didn't actually then take those steps to wind up the foundation, but it was voluntarily revoked when ACNC did a big clear out a couple of years ago of non-compliant foundations. So it hadn't been operating, but he just hadn't wound it up. So I think that's just a really good example. And obviously, I think what happened when this case came out in the media, he actually immediately lost, some key corporate sponsorship and support. And again, it just goes to show, if you're not across it, you're non-compliant, you will lose reputation, you will lose donations. So it's really important that we're strategy first, we've got transparency around what we're doing, and we distribute the funds. So to finish off, just some developments in the fundraising reforms. There's a Fix fundraising campaign. It was commenced in 2017 by a coalition of organisations advocating for reform of these complex laws and harmonisation. They've made some pretty good inroads in Vic, New South Wales and South Australia, but you've already seen, because I showed you the slides, not necessarily streamlined. Even if you're a charity registered with ACNC, you still then need to go the step further and register with CAV in New South Wales with their regulator, and in South Australia there's different rules altogether. So it's somewhat streamlined in the reporting because you only have to provide an information statement, but there's still all of that other steps that you still have to take to get approval. They've also just recently had a win in WA to streamline some of their processes, but there's still ongoing advocacy required to bring the other states along. One of the really good things is that they've worked with the ACL, that was a few years ago, to really try and work out how does those laws apply to fundraising, which is why I was able to present with great clarity on that front, because they got the ACL regulatory bodies to say how does misleading and deceptive conduct and unconscionable conduct apply to fundraising. So that was quite good. But what they're doing is they're calling for a single set of clear principles that each state and territory would need to adopt. So that's one of the things that they've flagged. Then on 14th of December 2021, the Federal Treasurer announced that the Council on Federal Financial Relations, I didn't even know that existed, so the CFFR, has made charitable fundraising rules reform one of its top 10 priorities for 2020. It's led by the Commonwealth and Victoria, and there's a proposal for a national framework that will be developed. If implemented, the reports are that it could finally fix the current minefield of overlapping and out-of-date regulations, But I'm not quite sure how the now federal election and the impact of that is going to affect this, because, you know, whenever there's a change of government, you don't know what stays, what sort of policies go out the window. I am sort of a little bit more optimistic that if Labor gets in federally, there will be benefits for not-for-profits, just because of a recent Albanese media release, which is obviously calling on not-for-profits to vote him in. But we don't know if that's going to be a priority, so we'll just have to wait and see. Yeah, so that's the end of my formal presentation, but happy to take any questions.
Great. That was great. Thank you. I learned a lot, and now I've got to somehow deliver that next week. Any questions from anyone? There's a few people on the grid. Anyone in the cloud space? Any questions?
Actually, yes, because we've been doing some stuff with political parties who fall in under technically NFPs. How do, I guess, political donations fit in with all of that? Or are they a completely different subset?
Good question. I think we should check that. But I would imagine they would fall under it. This is the type of questions I need so that we can check. But if they're a not-for-profit, then I imagine they would have to fall on it. But let me cross-check that for you.
Thank you.
You do need to comply. I do know, obviously, that political donations don't attract UK DPR as a political party, so they're not tax deductible. But there are certain rules you need to comply with in terms of fundraising, and also political donations are quite prescriptive, and so you actually any political donation that is made must be disclosed, and you must form part of the public register of political donations, and you cannot make one donation of more than $4,000 to a sitting MP in any one election cycle. Anyway, there's it's a whole nother minefield.
Yeah, because we don't want to be the US.
Yeah, and so obviously it's a very public process here in Australia, but also it's a very prescriptive process in relation to the amounts and the frequency.
Come on, guys, hit me.
Kylie Wallace, you're on the grid. Any questions from you? Somebody who does enjoy lots of fundraising.
Yeah, hi Kylie. I saw you on the thing. I met Kylie just the other week, Dee.
Ah, here you go.
Okay, you go.
Hi, Catherine. I'd be interested in, like, when are the sort of circumstances where, giving to not-for-profits or charities, where issues arise? Like, what are the most common circumstances where issues arise?
Yeah, the ones that I saw were like people on the street. So, we call them chuggers, but, they might not be asking for coins. They might be asking to sign up for ongoing payments. Obviously, they've got KPIs. They've got things that motivate them to get people to sign up. So the cases that I saw were around them acting unconscionably in trying to convince someone, maybe a vulnerable person, for example. The example in my paper was someone, English as a second language. He didn't really understand what he was signing up to. He was told it was a one-off donation. He was actually signing up to a monthly donation. So it's that type of stuff that, that's why I say this is sort of not really relevant to our consulting business, because we do strategic fundraising through philanthropy and major donors and trusts and foundations. Whereas this, I think the fundraising laws really is more around when you're doing a general community campaign, when you're seeking donations from the public, maybe smaller amounts like $1,000 to $1,000. And that's where things can go right. And that's why there's a really good, on the ACNC's really good chapter and a whole paper on vulnerable people. So, it's similar to like the laws around, what is it, when can someone give consent? Can someone, if they've got a disability, some kind of condition, it's similar to that. It's around how do we make sure that they understand the information we're giving them, and how can tick off on our obligations that we've explained what we need to explain, because they still have the right to spend their money and donate to a charity, but it's just around making sure we're not putting undue pressure and influence on them. So they're really the cases that I've seen have been these for-profit organisations that they're engaged externally to do these big fundraising campaigns. Yeah.
Thank you.
Question in the boardroom here. We're on mute. Catherine, hi, great presentation. I'm just wondering, in your line of work, do you ever have groups or people approach you where you wonder whether they do sort of meet the threshold of a charitable entity? And if so, like, how do you go about sort of distinguishing between maybe something that's a charity and something that might not be, like a non-for-profit, but it's not a charity necessarily?
Yes, I did actually have to, as a good lawyer, find the definition of that. It was one of those things that I learnt sort of for the first time. I'm like, God, I should have known this. Let me see if I can find it. Because the because the definition of a not-for-profit versus a charity is that a charity has to be operating for a charitable purpose, and it's not something that I would normally deal with. Probably more Dee would deal with around when you're setting up the organisation. Is it going to be a charity that has to be registered with the ACNC, or is it going to be a not-for-profit? But I think the thing that the people in the room will need to know, Dee, is that it's not the definition when they're setting up their organisation, are you a not-for-profit charity? It's the definition under the fundraising laws. I cannot believe they made different definitions in different states around what's deemed a charity and what's deemed a not-for-profit. But I guess for the purpose of answering the question, we do need to check with our clients, because it'll make a difference around, you know, whether they can give tax deductibility if they receive donations, which does make it easier or harder for us, because a lot of the trusts and foundations won't distribute funds unless you've got DGR. So it'll mean that then our strategy would change to being just seeking donations from people that don't care about getting a tax receipt. So it makes it a bit harder. So yeah, it's a complex area that I think organisations just need to be aware that it's a different definition, and I'll have to go cross-check it with the specific fundraising legislation regime in their, whatever applies in their state. So I think that's the kind of thing that, Dee, you won't be able to deal with on the stage, because you can't possibly know the 7 regimes off the top of your head. So I think it'll be saying, yeah. Good question.
There's just in the chat, Kylie's driving, so she apologises, but she said, thank you for the presentation. It's been great. We'd obviously like to encourage charities to get better at their compliance. Can't believe it's only at 30%. And then she wanted to know, where should we be directing them to get simple, clear information besides obviously coming to us? Is there anywhere where they can find this sort of information?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Kylie, thank you for listening in, driving. We'll send you the paper, because it kind of, I've gathered all of the resources into this one document. I think it's like 27 pages, and I would like for Demetrio and I to consider how we put this on our website so people can just put in their email and get a free download, because we actually I don't think, this is what Moore's told me, but I don't think that we actually want this work, because from my understanding, the time it takes to help someone do a fundraising approval, we can't get a profit on from it, you know, charging a lawyer rate. Maybe Dee can come up with, like, you know, a paralegal or a junior situation. But I think what we need to do is actually provide them with the free resources that are out there, which is really the best is the ACNC, but that's only relevant if they're a charity. And then if they're a not-for-profit, our paper will probably be the most useful, because they need to go to the state-based legislation and regulatory sites to work out, as a not-for-profit, how do we need to comply. So yeah, that, and Justice Connect. So the 2 key areas that I found this information from were ACNC and Justice Connect. So Justice Connect is now called Not-for-Profit Law, isn't it? So Not-for-Profit Law, and they're the ones that are doing the fixed fundraising campaign. and they provide a free legal service of information for not-for-profit. So I'd be really pushing people to call Justice Connect, go to ACNC website, read our paper, and then really just be using our services. I think for that board training day, I'd love to do more of that board training. That'd be easy for us to come up with a really great package, do an hour presentation to boards. We should also be selling our fundraising policy, because the fundraising policy is pretty cool that we've developed, so we can co-brand that. And obviously then if they want to register as a charity or work out their governance structure, I do refer matters to Dee for that. Yeah. Thanks, Kylie.
Awesome. All right. Well, conscious of time, and a big thank you to you, Catherine. That was great, super insightful, and obviously a very messy area. And I think you're right. It's ripe for kind of support, and we have not-for-profits, very large ones, very small ones, all facing the same kind of hurdles, and some have more resources than others to kind of go through it. And I know both of us sit on various not-for-profits, and just kind of seeing all the challenges that they go through around fundraising. So I think you're right. There's a big opportunity here for both organisations to do something together. But if anyone has any questions, please reach out to Catherine direct. I too will become an expert at this by next Friday, so happy to help as well. But Catherine, a big thank you to you. Have a great rest of the day, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thanks everyone.
Right.
See ya.
Thanks.